Section 3, Authorized Relationships, Duties, and Disclosures. Key term review. Administrative law is a body of law created by administrative agencies in the form of rules, regulations, orders, and decisions. Agent is a person entrusted with another's business, the person authorized by the principal to act on the principal's behalf. At arm's length means the people conduct negotiations on their own behalf without trusting the other's fairness or integrity and without being subject to the other's control or influence. Caveat emptor, meaning buyer beware. Common law is judge-made law manifested in decrees and judgments of the courts, case law as opposed to statutory law. Consent to transition is a written agreement to gain the principal's written permission to a change in brokerage relationship. Customer is a member of the public who is or may be a buyer or a seller of real property and may or may not be represented by a real estate licensee in an authorized brokerage relationship. Designated sales associates are two real estate licensees from the same brokerage company designated to represent the buyer and the seller as single agents in non-residential transactions. Dual agency refers to a broker representing as a fiduciary both the buyer and the seller in a residential real estate transaction. Dual agency is illegal in Florida. Fiduciary occurs when a broker is in a relationship of trust and confidence with the broker as agent and the seller or the buyer as principal. General agent is authorized by the principal to handle the affairs related to a business or trade, or to handle all the business at a certain location, for example, a property manager. Limited representation is non-fiduciary representation to a buyer, a seller, or both in a real estate transaction. No brokerage relationship is an arrangement where the broker does not represent either the buyer or the seller, but instead the broker works to facilitate the transaction. Non-representation is a no brokerage relationship. Principal is the seller or the buyer, but not both, in a single agent relationship. The principal authorizes the agent to act on the principal's behalf, while the principal is responsible for the actions of the agent. Residential sale is defined in Florida license law to mean the sale of improved residential property of 4 or fewer units, the sale of unimproved residential property intended for use as 4 or fewer units, or the sale of agricultural property of 10 or fewer acres. Single agent is a broker who represents either the buyer or seller, but not both, and has a fiduciary relationship with the party represented. Special agent is authorized by the buyer or the seller to handle only a specific business transaction or to perform a specific act. A broker who has a single agent relationship is a special agent with limited power or authority. Statutory laws are written statutes and rules enacted by the legislature. Subagent is a person authorized to assist and represent the agent and whose duties are delegated by the original agent. Transaction broker is a broker who provides limited representation to a buyer, a seller, or both in a real estate transaction, but who does not represent either party in a fiduciary capacity or as a single agent. Key concepts. Laws of agency. Common law is judge-made law, case law. Statutory law is enacted by the legislature. Administrative law consists of rules and regulations created by administrative agencies. Agency relationships in general business dealings. A person who delegates authority to another is called the principal. Agent is the person entrusted with another's business. A fiduciary acts in a position of trust and confidence for another. Caveat emptor means let the buyer beware. General agent is authorized by the principal to perform acts associated with the continued operations of a particular job or a certain business of the principal. Special agent is authorized to perform a specific act. 3 brokerage relationship options in Florida. 1, transaction broker. 2, single agent. And 3, no brokerage relationship, non-representation. The appropriate type of agency relationship is determined by the broker. And dual agency occurs when a brokerage firm represents as a fiduciary both the buyer and seller in the same real estate transaction. Residential transactions. Improved residential property of 4 or fewer units, unimproved residential property intended for use as 4 or fewer units, and agricultural property of 10 or fewer acres. Disclosure requirements do not apply to non-residential transactions, rental or leasing of real property unless there is an option to purchase property improved with 4 or fewer residential units, auctions, appraisals, and business enterprises or business opportunities unless improved with 4 or fewer residential units. Transaction broker relationship. The broker may work as a transaction broker for the buyer and or the seller. It's a presumed relationship. Transaction brokers provide limited representation. The buyer or seller is not responsible for the acts of the licensee. Parties give up their right to undivided loyalty. Allows licensee to facilitate the transaction by assisting both buyer and seller. A written disclosure notice is not required for residential real estate transactions when a transaction broker relationship is established. Duties of a transaction broker: account for all funds, disclose all known facts that materially affect the value of residential real property and are not readily available to the buyer, deal honestly and fairly, use skill, care, and diligence in the transaction, present all offers and counteroffers in a timely manner, even if a valid contract exists, exercise limited confidentiality unless waived in writing by a party, provide any additional duties that are mutually agreed to with a party. Single agent relationship. The broker may work as a single agent for either the buyer or the seller, but not for both in the same transaction. Dual agency is illegal in Florida. Fiduciary relationship, broker agent and seller or the buyer, principal or client. A single agent disclosure notice must be made before or at the time of entering into a listing agreement or an agreement for representation or before showing the property, whichever occurs first. Single agent relationship duties: account for all funds, disclose all known facts that materially affect the value of residential real property and are not readily observable, deal honestly and fairly, confidentiality, obedience, must obey all lawful instructions of the principal, loyalty, act solely in the best interest of the principal, full disclosure, use skill, care, and diligence in the transaction, present all offers and counteroffers in a timely manner, even if a valid contract exists. Subagents are persons authorized to assist and represent the agent. A subagent has the same duties as the agent. A broker's sales associates are general agents of the broker and subagents of the broker's principals. In a single agent relationship, the broker is an agent of the principal. Because a sales associate is an agent of the broker, the sales associate is a subagent of the principal. Sales associates and broker associates owe the same fiduciary obligations to the principal as does their broker. No brokerage relationship non-representation. The broker may act in a no brokerage relationship. The broker doesn't represent either the buyer or the seller. The no brokerage relationship notice must be disclosed in writing before showing of the property. No brokerage relationship duties: account for all funds entrusted to a licensee, disclose all known facts that materially affect the value of residential real property, and deal honestly and fairly. Brokerage relationship limitations. If the brokerage firm has a transaction broker relationship with the seller, the brokerage firm can also work with the buyer in the same transaction as a transaction broker or in no brokerage relationship. The brokerage firm cannot represent the buyer as a single agent if the firm has a transaction broker relationship with the seller. If the brokerage firm is representing the seller as a single agent, the brokerage firm can work with the buyer in the same transaction in no brokerage relationship. The brokerage firm cannot represent the buyer as a single agent or work with the buyer as a transaction broker if the firm is also representing the seller as a single agent. The brokerage relationship limitations apply even if the buyer and seller are working with different sales associates in the same brokerage firm. Written disclosure requirements for residential transactions. Duties of the single agent relationship and non-representation must be disclosed in writing. The disclosure document may be separate or incorporated into another document. Broker must retain all required disclosure documents for 5 years on residential transactions that result in a written contract to purchase. Under Florida law, it is presumed that all licensees are operating as transaction brokers unless another brokerage relationship is established. Therefore, there is no requirement to give a written transaction broker disclosure notice to the buyer and/or the seller. Record keeping and retention of disclosure documents. Brokers must retain agreements that engage the services of a broker, retain brokerage relationship disclosure documents and buyer brokerage agreements for 5 years. Retention of documents applies to residential transactions that result in a written contract and non-residential transactions that utilize designated sales associates. Transition from single agent to transaction broker. Accomplished when the consent to transition to transaction broker notice. Buyers or sellers' signatures or initials required before the licensee may change from one brokerage relationship to another. If the principal refuses to sign or initial the consent to transition notice, the broker must continue to act as a single agent. Duties and obligations of the brokerage relationship law apply to all real estate transactions, non-residential transactions, designated sales associates. Buyer and seller must each have assets of at least $1 million. Broker designates one sales associate to work with buyer as a single agent and another to work with seller as a single agent. Broker facilitates and advises designated sales associates. Buyer and seller must request the arrangement. Buyer and seller must sign disclosure notice. Terminating a brokerage relationship. Fulfillment of brokerage relationship's purpose, performance, mutual agreement, expiration of terms of the agreement, broker renouncing relationship by giving notice, resignation, principal or customer revokes by giving notice, death of either party, destruction or condemnation of the property, and bankruptcy of the principal or customer. Important dates and time periods to remember. 5 years. Period required to retain brokerage relationship disclosures for all transactions that result in a written contract.